Hey, good morning, Drivetime. Welcome back. I'm your host, David Drum. And always the goal of this podcast and these videos is to help you grow and to help you get 1% better each week. Joining me this week is Pastor Mel Lawrenz. He is also the author of the book, A Chronicle of Grief. Mel, thank you for being here. Thank you for spending some time with us.
Glad to do it, David. Thank you.
So as you and I were discussing already, I think there's this general perception for guys as we go to church and we're listening to a pastor speak. We just make this assumption that as a pastor, you have it all figured out. Like you don't struggle with the things we struggle with. You don't have a hard time with the things that we have a hard time with. That you've got, you've knocked the ball out of the park in every area. And additionally, as an author, you had already written on the topic of grief before this book. And what I'm going to ask you to do, and I know for our listeners, they don't know really the setup behind this. But if you would take a couple of minutes and just frame up what's different about this book and why you chose to write this one versus your previous book about grief.
Yeah. Well, it's a book that I did not want to write and intended never to write, but I felt led to write it. As a pastor, of course, over the years, I officiated at funerals for young people and older people and cancer and murder and suicide and all the rest. I also had lost my own father when I was 4 years old and experienced different levels of loss with that over my growing up years. But when my 30-year-old daughter suddenly passed away 5 years ago, almost 5 years ago now, I was plunged with my wife and son into a whole different type of personal experience because it was not expected. She had been ill for several years, but not terminally ill. But she had an infection that ran away with her and she collapsed one day and she was gone. And I was plunged into what we call traumatic grief. Trauma is when you experience a loss that is out of the blue. It's unexpected. You started the day like a normal day and you didn't know you'd end up talking to a medical examiner that afternoon. That's trauma. And I'm a pastor, yeah, but I'm a father and my daughter was a beautiful young woman and it hit me like it would any man. And I went on a journey that was extremely difficult. And I wrote the book because I wanted to help people figure out how they can survive traumatic loss. And that's the operative word, is survive. The word survive means to go on living, to literally to live through. And I'm sure that there's a lot of your listeners who themselves or friends that they know are trying to survive a sudden and unexpected traumatic loss.
So now with this, and having read the book, the thing that I was really expecting was for the bulk of it to be a how to move through your grief and your pain. And really what I took away from it is yes, there are tangibles of how you process through, but you basically walk through the first year of life without your daughter. And I would say in a level of transparency that I didn't expect. You use the word plod quite a bit, that you were plodding along. And if you wouldn't mind, like, why did you use that term to describe your progress through that first year?
Yeah, that's what it means to survive. Is when, to plod means to walk slowly with great effort because of some resistance. And when you are slammed by a severe and traumatic loss, and it could be the death of a loved one, but it could also be suddenly losing your job. It could mean getting a totally unexpected, troubling diagnosis from your doctor. It can be the loss of a friend, being betrayed, all of these things. And it's interesting you mentioned that because many years ago, I used a illustration in a message that I gave in church, the example of William Carey, a missionary to India back in the 1700s, who, after working there for 17 years, lost all of his work in a warehouse fire and everything. No backup hard drive or anything. But before he ever went to India, he said, one thing I can do is I can plod. I can walk with great effort when times are tough. And what I tell people all the time who are going through a great loss is you have to live in the moment. Just take it one day at a time. It is a cliche, I know, but it's a cliche that is absolutely true. You take it one day at a time. You put one foot in front of the next. And I would also say this, that all of the great leaders in the world, whether it's the great leaders who got us to World War II or in other times in history, the one common denominator that they have is perseverance. They plod. They put one foot in front of the next. And I guess that whole year that I document in this book, I didn't write it after a year. I wrote it after about 3.5 years reflecting back. But it really is about all of the different things that I and my family needed to do just to keep moving forward. And then things get easier. Things, even with a terrible, terrible loss, it's different a year later. It's different 2 years later and 4 years later. Things get easier to bear, even though you will always feel that loss that you experienced.
So I was, as I was preparing for this, I was kind of going back through the book and looking at some stuff that I had highlighted. And, for me, and I would say that I'm between tragedies in a sense in my life. I've experienced traumatic loss. I'm fairly young, so I'm certain I'll experience it again. But I'm between those valleys. And, one of the things that I found, that I had to fall back onto was hope. And I underlined this quote from your book. You said, "Why have hope? Because the alternative is unthinkable. But more than that, there are real reasons for hope. Wishful thinking doesn't get us very far." And I was really struck by how straightforward of a comment that is, because the absence of hope is unbearable. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah. Here's the irony, is that the reason why my daughter's loss, losing my daughter, was so awful is because of how great it was to be her father, and what a delight that she was. And so it's the things that we value and cherish that when we lose them, we feel that. But that's also what gives us hope, is that to say, I could say today, life is always going to be awful because of this awful thing that I experienced. Or I could say, it was really good. One day my wife said to me, "Would you have rather that we had never had Eva, that she had never been born, or that we had her for 30 years and then lost her?" And it was a very wise question. I said, well, of course, we have 30 years. So that's why we have hope, is to say, it's the good things that we've experienced in life in the past, the gifts of God. Every good thing that we experience is a gift of God. That's reason to believe that that goodness is still there, And even my relationship with my daughter didn't die in an ambulance. I still love her. I still cherish now her memory, but that gives me hope too.
So as we're going through this video, would you say that hope is one of the most important things, or in this immediacy of the first year? And yeah, I get it. For some people, a year feels very long, but in that immediacy after tragedy, what is it that you would recommend as really a crucial component for surviving, for beginning that process of plotting through that first year and looking for hope?
Well, there are many things, David, and it's practical too. But I think the one that rises to the top for me is that I realized early on, and by the way, the first few weeks were torturous. And then the first few months were extremely painful. I mean, it changes over time, but when somebody suddenly dies, those first several days, you're confused, you feel panicky, whatever. And then it goes on from there. But the main thing was is to live in the present day, because when it was toughest, when I thought about the past, like recalling memories and that didn't help me at all. It just made me more profoundly sad and distressed. And then I found myself thinking about the future. I thought, well, how are we going to handle Christmas this year? Which was 6 months down the road. And I thought, well, that's a stupid thing to do. Why worry today about Christmas? And it kind of drove me back to, what Jesus said is, don't worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow has enough trouble of its own. And man, this has become for me just an overall life truth, is living in today, because the future is hypothetical. The past is done. Nobody can change the past. The only thing that I can change right now is the present day. The only path that I'm on right now is the path that's beneath my 2 feet. And that actually helped me to lessen the anxiety and the fear. Fear is a huge thing that you experience with traumatic loss, because death is suddenly like some monster that's coming and dragged your loved one away. But the way that I was able to cope with that was by just living in the moment.
Okay. And along those lines, you talk towards the end of the book, especially about, there's the old adage that time heals all wounds, and you kind of built out from that. And I think probably gave a much more truthful statement than time heals all wounds. Can you expand on that and explain what that means?
Well, time itself doesn't heal. Time itself doesn't heal. You need the passage of time to heal. I mean, if I got a gash on my arm and the doctor sews it up and so on, it will heal. But there's a regenerative power God-given that restores that tissue. And so what we need to do with the passage of time is to try to live as smartly as we can, as healthfully as we can. If in grief a person can't sleep or they're not eating, they're going to get themselves into trouble. If they're overly isolating themselves from other people, that can be a problem. Although I would say that there's no rules with grief. You're going to have to do what you're going to have to do. And even my wife, my son, and I experienced Eva's loss differently. But be as smart as you can, be as healthy as you can. And then with the passage of time, God heals our hearts. And he heals it, though, in such a way that it's not that the loss has been reversed, because just like somebody who loses their arm. Let's say they got gangrene and they lose their arm. They'll be much better adapted 3 years down the road, but their arm is still gone.
Right. That's an interesting perspective. And really from that, kind of what I'm hearing is that gash on your arm or that infection, whatever it is, yes, eventually it might resolve on its own, but by seeking out healthy habits and wise input and counsel, there is maybe an earlier healing or an earlier resolution to that injury. Would you say that's the same even in grief?
I'd say so. And I knew that for me, I needed to look this loss straight ahead. Within hours, my main thought was my family and I have entered into a harsh new reality, and the work of our life for weeks, months, years to come is going to be adapting to that harsh new reality. So if a person can, don't deny what has happened, look it straight in the face, talk to people that you trust and they care about you. Don't feel bad if you feel like not talking that much to people, but don't isolate yourselves overly much either.
So now you've jumped into the practicalities, which I like, and it's obviously extremely valuable. I want to highlight some of that because as you and I discussed here on Drivetime, we try to kind of land each episode on the tangible, something that we can do each week to help improve in this area. So if we've got a listener out there who is struggling, whether they're a week out of trauma, a month, a year, maybe even 10 years, but it's just not been dealt with, and you just kind of went through a progression and a list. Where do you think step one is?
Find one or more people that you trust, maybe a family member, maybe a friend who you can confide in. And I know in the next installment of your podcast, we're going to talk about what you can do if you're the person trying to support somebody in grief, which is extremely important. But if you're the person suffering the loss, find somebody that you trust and say, can I just tell you what's going on? And I think it's really great when grieving people can tell a trusted friend about the person that they lost. That's something, by the way, that we rarely think to ask a grieving person, is to say, tell me about your daughter. I got to tell you, David, every person, and there weren't that many of them, that said to me, tell me about your daughter. I mean, that was like a gift, an incredible gift, because they were showing not just an interest in my well-being, but they wanted to know. They wanted to know this good thing that was a part of your life that you're grieving right now.
That's interesting. And I would say, just like you referenced in next week's episode, when we have you back, I think there's obviously a lot of things we can dive into with that. But what I do want to do is thank you for sharing the story of your daughter with us, and for really processing it in a way that it comes out in your book, A Chronicle of Grief. Gentlemen, if this is a topic that is ringing in your ears and it's striking you as something you need to look into, or maybe you've got someone in your life that probably needs some help plodding along right now, I'm going to put the link to purchase the book in the description of the video. So definitely check that out. It's not it's not a light-hearted book, but it's also not one that gets so mired down in details that it's hard to process. It really is a very genuine walk through a year's worth of grief. And it's brief. It's really quite short. Well, here, let me give you the profile. It is definitely not the longest book I've read recently. So Mel, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for spending some time with us and sharing the story of your daughter with us. Gentlemen, that's the challenge this week, is to start processing some of that grief and moving forward. We'll see you again here next week, again on Drive Time.